the largest economy in the world default on what it owes? Will the United States run out of money from the 1st of June? And what will it mean for the finances of the world, since the dollar is the reserve currency for many nations? These are some of the questions being raised as hectic negotiations are on in the US to increase the debt ceiling. So what is this debt ceiling and why is everyone talking about it? Why has it become a reason for markets to be nervous? Before we get into that, let's get you what's happening right now. Earlier this evening, US President Joe Biden said he had a productive meeting and is confident an agreement is reached so that the US does not default on its obligations on the 1st of June. The backdrop to this is a tussle between a Democrat White House and Republican-dominated Congress on how much to increase the debt ceiling. This has been going on, by the way, since January, and there is no agreement so far. So what exactly is a debt ceiling? The US, like many countries around the world, spends more than it makes. To finance this extra spend, they have to take loans. This debt has to be paid every year, and there is a ceiling or a cap on how much debt the government can take. Now, this upper limit on loans needs to be cleared by the US Congress that has representatives of both parties. Right now, it's dominated by the Republicans. The idea is that there should be a check and balance in the system so that the US government doesn't keep on taking as much debt as it feels like and eventually sink the economy. This law, by the way, has quite a history. This law to have a debt ceiling was brought in 1917 in the backdrop of the First World War to ensure that too much isn't spent. But since then, this debt ceiling has been consistently increased. It has been increased, in fact, 78 times since 1960. The current limit of over $31 trillion was last revised in 2021. Both Republican and Democrat presidents routinely increase the debt ceiling, and it's always a tough negotiation if it's two different political sides fighting it out. Right now, the context is the next general election in America, which will take place next year. So the Republicans want Joe Biden to cut his spending on things like student loan clearances, social security spends, etc. Obviously, the Republicans, in this case, the opposition, don't want the current president to look like he delivered on what he promised before the next election. And there are genuine concerns over the health of the US economy. So what happens if they don't agree? Technically, the US Treasury cannot borrow more money after the 1st of June. That means the US government will default. They won't be able to pay back their loans. The consequences, if this actually happens, could be disastrous. Salaries of government employees may stop. Social security schemes won't get funding. Pensions will get impacted. There is one estimate that 70 lakh jobs will be lost in the US and the GDP will shrink by 4%. The consequences, by the way, would go beyond just the US. The world markets and economy would be hit badly. So will this disaster actually take place? It's very, very unlikely. This is a dance of negotiations that has taken place many times before, like a thriller that always has a happy ending. In the latest, Joe Biden is also hopeful that all will end well. Listen in to what he said earlier this evening.
We had a productive meeting yesterday, and with all four leaders in the Congress. It was civil and respectful, and everyone came to the meeting, I think, in good faith. I'm confident that we'll get the agreement on the budget, that America will not default. And every leader in the room understands the consequences if we fail to pay our bills. And it would be catastrophic for the American economy and the American people if we didn't pay our bills. And I'm confident everyone in the room agreed with the speaker, from the speaker to the majority leader, to the majority leader in the House and the Senate, the majority leader in the Senate, the minority leader in the Senate, as well as the leader, the Democratic leader in the House, that we're going to come together because there's no alternative. We have to do the right thing for the country. We have to move on. And to be clear, this negotiation is about the outlines of what the budget will look like, not about whether or not we're going to, in fact, pay our debts. The leaders have all agreed We will not default. Every leader has said that. And I'm proud of the progress my administration has made. We've reduced the deficit in the first 2 years by $1.7 trillion in the first 2 years. And I proposed a budget that would reduce another $3 trillion over the next decade. That includes more revenue by asking the wealthy and large corporations to begin to pay their fair share, and cutting subsidies that exist in the law now to big oil and big pharma.
All right, Tamanna Inamdar, senior journalist and economist, with me on the show this evening. Ajay Bagga, markets expert, speaking with me. Robinder Sachdev, economy and foreign policy expert, on the show. I'm also speaking this evening with Ray Locker, journalist and author. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for joining us on Beyond the Headline, where we're hoping to break down what the whole hue and cry is about as far as the debt ceiling goes. Mr. Iyer, let me begin with you. Is this a political fight, or is this a real economic crisis?
This is political theater. We have been through this again and again in the past. I'm sure we will go through it again in the future. The same headlines of, do you know what will happen if the US defaults? Do you know how many jobs go? Do you know what the problem is going to be? There was a crisis like this in 1995 when Clinton was there, another in 2011 when Obama was there. It even got to the point where they said, okay, we've crossed the debt ceiling. What happened then? Certain kinds of payments were not made. You see, as long as you keep making the payments on your bonds and interest, that part is okay. Ultimately, what happened in both those cases was that people started looking at opinion polls. When they found that the opinion polls were putting the blame more and more on the Republicans did not want to look so bad for causing this particular situation in the run-up to the election the next year. And therefore, after a certain amount of negotiation, they gave way. In one case, Clinton also came forward a little. So this is a theater, and this will be fixed. Don't take it too seriously. There was a guy in the Standards and Poor's who in 2011 got so worried that he reduced the AAA rating of the USA. Worrying about, my God, look what will happen if there's a default. The USA did not default, but that particular gentleman in Standard & Poor was sacked. So, let us not make the same mistake of that particular gentleman thinking that there's going to be a disaster. The United States' credit rating is going to go. This is political theater. As we get closer to the actual date, I think if the public opinion polls will tell you who is going to give way more. If you find that the Republicans are looking bad in the opinion polls, the Republicans will give way. If it's the other way around, then the Democrats will give way. But this will be resolved one way or another. Please do not mistake this for a real crisis.
Okay, so it's not a real crisis. It's given us a great opportunity to explain what the hue and cry is about. But then I want to understand, and I'm coming to Ray Locker on this. If everyone knows this is a political theater, as Swaminathan Iyer said, why are markets worried? Why is everyone talking about this massive deadlock? Eventually, no one side can say, I don't care. Let the US government default. That's just not going to happen. So why go through the charade?
Well, why indeed? Everybody does know it's ridiculous. It's been ridiculous from the very beginning. As the previous commentator mentioned, we've had these crises periodically, most often because Republicans have taken over one or two parts of Congress, and they started a crisis that didn't need to happen. I think the main concern here is you have a Republican Party enthralled to Donald Trump, who has gone out publicly and said default would be a good thing or something that we should consider. I think we all know that's a nightmare. But so many people follow him, and he has control over this party in a lot of different ways. And most serious people know that there is an element within the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives that doesn't really seem to listen to reason. And Kevin McCarthy only has a 3-vote majority in the House. So he has to listen to these people. He basically sold his soul to get the speakership to extremists within his party. So we don't know who in that party would see reason, who would vote for a debt ceiling increase that McCarthy backed with a majority of Democrats. So that's the sense of mystery, of suspense there. Bottom line is everybody knew this was theater from the very beginning, but sometimes theater can go wrong. Sometimes the curtains can collapse, the sets could fall down, and that's what could happen here.
Okay. I love the way that theater analogy is going forward. Sometimes the curtain can collapse, the sets can fall down. Ajay Bagga, what are the chances of that happening? And is this time different also because of the actors in this theater? In the backdrop, there is one Mr. Trump who wants to come back in 2024. There is, Mr. McCarthy on a sticky wicket. There's Joe Biden wanting to spend himself back into power. So just set the scene for us about why it's become so tricky.
Yeah, it is theater, very much what Swami sir said and Ray said. It is the theater of the absurd, because we are reaching a state where US is capable of paying all its bills. Yes, all countries have debt levels. It is 105% of its GDP in the case of the US, but it is capable. But political disagreements could lead to a very chaotic situation in case, some kind of a deal doesn't happen. What we are expecting, Tamanna, like you mentioned, since 1960, there have been a number of times, 78 times that they have resolved this. We are hoping that they will come very near to the brink and then pull back. Yesterday, 140 CEOs of US corporations wrote both to the Congress leaders as well as the White House leadership that please don't do this. It will be devastating, very destabilizing. So there is a lot of angst in the markets. Stock markets are still not showing it so much, but bond markets are behaving like 2011. If we just look at what happened in 2011, if you take it from July of 2011 to about September, August 2nd is when the deal got done, and August 5th, 2011 is when the US rating was downgraded to AA+. Between that period, the S&P 500 went down from 1350 to 1100, so about a 20% fall. The US Treasuries actually became more higher performance. The yields went down from 3% to 1.8%. So there was safe haven buying. Here there was fear that US is defaulting, but the bond market, which knows the best, they were buying US assets. US dollar went up, gold went up nearly 15%. So that's what you can expect to happen. Stock market and risk assets go down. The bonds will rally because of safe haven. Of course, in 2011, we also had the European sovereign debt crisis looming large. So US was seen as a big safe haven, but the dollar has started moving. Last week, it was up 1%. Yesterday, it was up 0.4%. So the dollar strength is showing through already, Tamanna. So yeah, what do we expect? We expect some amount of volatility. Everybody is expecting that it's a known unknown, that we know this happens regularly. The unknown factor is the Trumpists, is the progressives on the other side, and also the difference between the two. Biden wants to raise revenues by raising taxes without cutting spends. The Republicans want spends to be curtailed. Now, what has happened historically, when Clinton balanced the budget and got a surplus, George Bush Jr. came in and cut the taxes, and those taxes never got raised. Same thing with Obama. He tried to balance the budget after 2011. There was a Budget Control Act that came in. So Obama was trying to curtail and save some surplus. Up comes Trump, and he cuts the taxes. And that you can really draw a line right up to Ronald Reagan when the taxes started getting cut. The US debt was less than $1 trillion. Today, it is $31.4 trillion and galloping. Now, it is not something that you should be leaving for the future generations, but that is the reality. Given the budget and given...
Complete your point, Mr. Bagga.
Yeah, no, just I was saying that's the reality that the Republicans won't let you raise the taxes. So Americans want the spending to stay, the welfare state to stay, but nobody is willing to pay the taxes. Unlike Europe, which is paying 50% taxes, which has a GST, a VAT in place, Americans are not paying that kind of taxes. Yes, Tamanna.
Okay, so someone has to pay the bills eventually. It comes down to very essential economics. Someone has to pay the bills. Right now, there's a fight about, and it's a political fight about what's going to make the other side look bad. Will Mr. Biden have to walk back on everything he's promised? And I was explaining this earlier today that in the Indian context, his freebies, in the Indian political context, will he have to walk back his freebies? Will the Republicans get their pound of flesh? But Mr. Sachdev, I want to come to a very basic question, because we're also trying to break down this subject for our audience this evening. Why does the US have to keep raising the debt ceiling time and again? That's an astonishing figure. 78 times in the last 60 years.
Thank you so much, Tamanna.
Don't they know how much they're going to spend every year? Yes.
Yeah, sure. Couple of points. One, in a big picture, I'll come to your answer or your question, but in a big picture, what we're seeing in the US playing out right now, let us remember that the US has a culture of negotiation. Both parties will negotiate. By parties, I don't mean political parties. It's in American culture. They negotiate, they play hardball, and then they come to a solution. That's the American mindset. I used to teach American culture, by the way, so that's where I'm coming from. So that's one. Any sides, that's the American approach to things. Okay, you oppose me, I oppose you. Let's sit down, let's negotiate, let's make a deal. That's one. So that's what's been happening. Secondly, why this is happening continuously is that American tax revenues are about, right now, let's say, about $5 trillion. American expense of the federal budget is around 6.5 to 7 trillion. And we should distinguish between these two things. When there's talk that America debt ceiling of $31.4 trillion is a very different number. The number right now in contention is that the American income of the federal government is around $5 trillion, and they've spent, or they need to spend, around $7 trillion. So there's a shortfall of $2 trillion. So what the American government then does, as has been happening over multiple times, it goes to the Congress and say that, okay, fine, we as a country have, let's say, a debt right now, 31.4 trillion. So what will happen at the end of this exercise, by the way, you will see the Congress will raise, okay, fine, the federal budget needs 7 minus 5 is equal to 2, 31.4 already, that means 31.4 added 2. We put the limit to $33.5 trillion. That's what will happen. And in that process, this whole, negotiating tactics of tax cuts and welfare, etc., will play out. Now, a couple of points to the markets and all, etc. And what happens if there's a shutdown, let's say? If today or tomorrow or whatever the date, the federal government does not have this approval of additional $2 trillion to raise via bonds, what happens? The federal government shuts down. It has shut down few times earlier, as our colleagues have said. In fact, I've been there a couple of times when I was there, I think, early 2000s, and also I was there in the mid 2011, etc. So we were there. So what was happening was that federal employees, it's a shutdown of the federal government. Federal employees, contractors laid off, told, okay, fine, for the next 2 weeks, don't expect a paycheck.
Yes.
Reserve parks, free tickets, closed down. And that happens for about maybe 1 to 2 weeks. And then this limit is approved and everything comes back and retrospective done. So what I mean, you mentioned the term, is it a dance? It is a tango. It is a tango and it gets resolved. Particularly, that's in the nature of American policy wherever, even in the world affairs, they negotiate. That's what's happening.
No, but in a negotiation, one minute. I just want to take that further. In a negotiation, someone wins and someone loses. Always. Swaminathan Iyer, where is this stacked right now? Because at the end of the day, remember, this is a pre-election year. The Republicans are demanding a lot from the Biden administration. So how do you think this is going to end?
As I said, you will find both sides will desperately looking at the opinion polls. It is not so much that it will be decided by Mr. X or Mr. Y, so much as by John Doe. You will find on the previous two occasions when you found that, there is going to be various people not getting their salary, various contractors not getting their money. So a blame game will begin. Who is to blame for this? If the people think that the Republicans are more to blame, then the Republicans will tend to give way. If the people think the Democrats are more to blame, the Democrats will begin to give way. So at this point of time, let us wait and see. I think right now, I cannot say which of the two sides is likely to give way. The opinion polls will decide that.
As a system, Ajay Bagga, there is something to be said for the idea of check and balance, especially at a time when a lot of nations are outspending their limits. There is really, we've seen so many drown in debt. We're seeing that economic crisis coming in. Do you think the system makes sense?
No, it doesn't. It's a system of absurdities because the same Congress passes the budget. So this budget is passed. The debt needed to execute this budget is coming up, and you are creating all this nonsense and talking of defaulting. 84% of global foreign currency transactions are happening in the dollar. 50% of global trade is denominated in the dollar. 59% of FX reserves of the globe are sitting in US dollar. So there has to be some responsibility before Trump goes on a CNN town hall and says a default is good and we should default. $24 trillion, Tamanna, of US government treasuries are outstanding. $24 trillion out of this 31 trillion debt that the US owes to the world and to its own population. You're talking of 25% of the global GDP is outstanding. That is the scale which is, which bothers the markets. Hopefully nothing goes wrong. It's a very small tail risk, very low probability. But if, anything goes wrong, then the measures, as you said, 4 to 6% of a US GDP falling, then it cascades to the global GDP. Chinese, as the suppliers of choice to the US, are the next affected. Then all the suppliers to the Chinese start suffering, and that's how a domino starts falling. So overall, it's really absurd. It's an artificial ceiling. The problem is US is spending more than it's earning. The Republicans are not willing to increase the taxes. The Democrats want to keep running the welfare state. They are the policemen of the world. So you have $800 billion of military expenditure. You have $1.2 trillion of all the welfare measures, which can't be really cut. But what is happening? You have raised the rate from 0 to 5%. You are paying $450 billion as interest. Now, this year, you will pay something like $800 billion. And it will go more than $1 trillion a year down the line as the old bonds at lower rates start maturing. That's the kind of change coming in, and you are not ready to raise any more taxes anywhere in the whole system. So it's a fundamental issue. It's a structural issue. It has to be dealt. But at 105% of GDP, the growth and the inflation will take care of it. That's the classical economics. So it's still not worrisome overall. The worry is disagreements and political posturing and the theater of the absurd leading to a chaotic outcome. That's the only worry. On a structural basis, we are all fine.
We are all fine. The outcome, I mean, maybe the path to the outcome is chaotic, but there doesn't seem to be too much of a, conflict or a different point of view of what the outcome will be. They'll definitely get there. But an interesting sort of maybe precursor or sideshow to a political battle in the United States. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us on the lead story this evening as we're breaking down that